And now, stand-up community subscribers and listeners from around the globe, it's time to Stand Up with Pete Dominic, where we ask the important questions that impact you, your family, and your community. Such as, is there a better way to buy used furniture than asking my chain-smoking stepmother to sell me her used sofa? And with intense winter storms now blanketing most of the U.S., when will I be safe enough to go outside and build a naughty snowman? And now, the podcast host who keeps invasive pests out of his garden with his naughty snowman, Pete Dominic!
Yes, indeed. The man is never wrong. It's like he lives inside my head. That is the great Pete Co., who is buying a smoke-saturated couch from his mother-in-law. I mean, there has to be some truth in that, right, Pete? Hello, everybody. Welcome to Stand Up. Very excited to share my conversation with Dr. Angie Rasmussen with you today. Or is it Rasmussen? I don't know. I'm not sure. I think that name can be pronounced both ways. Doesn't matter. She's a virologist. She's a brainiac. She's got a massive following and presence on Twitter. And I think you're going to really like our hour-long conversation today. Angela Rasmussen joins me for my very special guest. Only one guest today, but we learn a lot from her. You're going to learn a lot from her. I certainly did in our conversation. And I'm going to go back and listen to this again because there's a lot of good stuff that I really want to know about and think about moving forward when it comes to viruses and pandemics and vaccines and society and so much more. You're really going to like it, I bet. Okay, so also just want to mention it's Thursday and we hang out tonight at 8 East with stand-up community members for our always fun virtual happy hour stand-up happy hour hangout. I do have to mention here on the show, I'm looking to hire somebody part-time. I'm going to put this out there to subscribers first, but if you have any experience or if you know somebody, maybe your son or daughter, maybe you have a relative or a friend who has experience with video editing and social media, I'm looking to bring someone on a few hours a week to help me out with that stuff. So I want to hire somebody that listens to the show or is at least somehow interested in the show and tangentially involved with it. It's not going to be a lot of money. It's just a few hours a week. And I had a great young man, Vince Leaf, doing this work for me for a while, but he's gotten busy. And so and that's Dan Leaf, who's a longtime listener's son. So definitely looking for someone that knows video editing and social media stuff. And I'm probably going to be hiring an intern, too. So maybe your son or daughter or whatever would want to intern on the show if they're a college student. If you know anybody like that, let me know. standupwithpete@gmail.com. All right, now with that said, let's get to the news. Lots to talk about in today's Last 24. All right, well, I feel like there were a couple of stories that were driving the day yesterday. Of course, the stunning news that CNN chief executive Jeff Zucker stepped down from the helm over there. Then you got the story about the NFL football coach Brian Flores, who's accusing the NFL of racial discrimination. Huge story rocking professional sports and the NFL just weeks shortly before the Super Bowl. Then, of course, you get the Whoopi Goldberg comments and developments that is in its, I guess, third day now. And, of course, COVID news, Ukraine, Russia, and so much more. So let's get to some of the clips I found for you today in today's audio selection here on Stand Up. First, shocking news to the media world that CNN Jeff Zucker suddenly stepped down yesterday. Let's go to CNN for the report. Here is Jake Tapper with their media reporter, Brian Stelter, laying it out for you in a couple minutes here, and then I'll give you some reaction on the other side.
Brian, Jeff Zucker said that his departure stems from an independent investigation into former CNN anchor Chris Cuomo. An investigation into how Chris tried to help his brother, disgraced then New York Governor Andrew Cuomo. Can you explain that to our viewers? Because I think a lot of people don't understand why that would lead to this.
Right. Zucker's undoing stems from the Cuomo brothers scandal because, as we all remember, Zucker defended Chris Cuomo and kept him on the air at 9 p.m. during the then governor's scandal. Eventually, Zucker fired Cuomo in early December after further revelations about how the brothers worked together. But before taking action, CNN retained a law firm called Cravath. Cravath was brought in to review the Cuomo matter. Cravath had a lot to look into, including an allegation of sexual misconduct against Chris Cuomo from a former junior colleague. Cuomo denied that allegation. But Cravath has been doing interviews, looking into Cuomo, looking for any issues. That's actually been going on as recently as last week. And Zucker was brought in last week for questioning as a result of that probe. So we have a domino effect here from Andrew Cuomo to Chris Cuomo and now to Jeff Zucker. Zucker was brought in and questioned, and one of the topics was about this relationship with Allison Gullist, the longtime CNN chief communications executive and now chief marketing officer. She has been Zucker's right-hand woman for years. They've been working together, dating back to their days together at NBC. And that relationship, which then turned romantic, is at issue here, Jake.
So, as I understand it, Brian, first of all, Jeff and Allison are both divorced. And Allison doesn't report to Jeff. She reports to somebody with Warner Media. So the issue here is not necessarily of the relationship, but that it wasn't disclosed to CNN's parent company, Warner Media. Do I have that right?
Disclosure does seem to be the key issue here. And Zucker acknowledged that in his statement this morning, saying, quote, as part of the investigation into Cuomo's tenure at CNN, I was asked about a consensual relationship with my closest colleague. I acknowledged the relationship evolved in recent years. Here's the key line. I was required to disclose it when it began, but I didn't. I was wrong. As a result, I am resigning today. Gullist is saying she's intending to stay with CNN. She's also acknowledging, though, in a statement that the relationship changed during COVID and, quote, I regret that we didn't disclose it at the right time. So there's this issue of disclosure, which is spelled out in Warner Media's standards of business conduct. It's something that lots of corporate America firms have, where if you end up in a romantic relationship at work, you need to tell a superior. Of course, we're talking about two of the superiors at CNN here, so they would have had to go up to the top of Warner Media to disclose it, and they're both acknowledging this wasn't disclosed. Now, if there's other shoes that are going to drop here, Jake, maybe there will, maybe there won't. Right now, no other shoes have dropped. For now, this is a story about two people in a consensual relationship who didn't tell management, and because that has all come out in the midst of a Chris Cuomo legal battle, Jeff Zucker resigned, effective immediately.
All right, Brian Stelter, thanks so much. Appreciate it.
Well, there you have it from Brian Stelter with Jay Tapper on a grim day for CNN and anchors and everybody who works there, I suppose, unless you hated Jeff Zucker. The reaction came hard and fast on social media, of course. Ben Smith, New York Times media writer, tweets, the Cuomo blast radius is incredible. Eric Wempels, also Washington Post media critic, tweeted, this is a cable news cataclysm. More reactions. Ian Millhiser. I feel like Jeff Zucker has done an objectively terrible job of running CNN. Its ratings are in the toilet, and I have no idea who they view as their target audience, or even if it has occurred to them to target a particular audience. Washington Examiner's Seth Mandel reacted joking, now how is Trump going to get elected again, to Zucker stepping down. Chuck Ross on Twitter, amazing, just amazing. Clown News Network. And finally, Steve Morris, pulling no punches, former Media Matters. And now at the recount, Steve Morris writes, Jeff Zucker is one of the most morally bankrupt people alive and one of the most responsible of the deterioration of political media. He chose to treat the existence of a multiracial liberal democracy as less important than getting himself even more rich. Good fucking riddance. All right, Steve Morris. And that is just a little bit, a tiny fraction of the reaction from media world to Jeff Zucker's stunning departure as the head of CNN. I'm sure I'll have more reaction and talk with folks about what this means in the coming days, and I'll probably bring it up at tonight's Hangout as well. So prepare your reactions, ladies and gentlemen. All right, the other big story yesterday was about, this is not really a sports story. It's kind of a story about race and culture in sports, and I'm always interested in that and learning about it. But former Miami Dolphins coach Brian Flores filed a class action lawsuit against the NFL and several teams this week, accusing them of sham interviews, incentivizing losses, and pressure to improperly recruit players. The league and three of the teams involved, the Dolphins, the New York Giants, and the Denver Broncos, denied his allegations in short order and argued that they did more than enough by writing "End Racism" in the end zones this year. What more can you ask of them? But I kid. Here now is a little bit. He gave a bunch of interviews yesterday, CBS and CNN. Brian Flores, in his own words,
we didn't have to file a lawsuit for the world to know that there's a problem from a hiring standpoint in regards to minority coaches in the National Football League. The numbers speak for themselves.
All right, let me give you a little bit more from Brian Flores. Here he is on CBS, and he was asked, I guess, how he's feeling right now, and he gives a pretty sobering answer to that question.
Humiliation, disbelief, anger. And I've worked so hard to get to where I am from in football to become a head coach. Put 18 years in this league, and it was to go on what was going to be what felt like or what was a sham interview. I was hurt. And,
but you went knowing that you probably weren't going to get it. Why did you continue to go?
I think there's still hope, and maybe call it the audacity of hope.
I thought this was an interesting reaction from former Cincinnati Bengals head coach Marvin Lewis, who seconded Brian Flores' claims that black coaches were receiving sham interviews from NFL teams. Lewis got passed up for a white coach at Carolina, at the Tampa Bay, and in Buffalo before landing with the Bengals, so he knows a thing or two about this, according to the reporting that I'm reading here. And so here is former Cincinnati Bengals head coach Marvin Lewis yesterday on ESPN.
Well, I did interview with the Carolina Panthers before John Fox got the job, and I can recall that we had lost to the Steelers in the second round of the playoffs. And I remember sitting home on Monday, and I think it was Chris Mortensen or someone else reported that Foxy would be named the head coach of the Panthers on Friday. And when I went to work Tuesday, Brian came in and said, "Hey, I just got off the phone with Ozzie, and the Panthers want you to come down and interview for the job." I said, "Coach, I just heard last night on TV that they're going to name Foxy the coach on Friday." He said, so he goes back, he talks to Ozzie, talks to the people, and I end up going down to Charlotte and so forth and meeting with the Richardson family. And, they said that wasn't true and so forth. And they named John the head coach on Friday. So, I don't know, again, that's the situation I was in, but you have to go and prove that you're worthy to become the head coach. And, and it's, you're appreciative of the opportunity, but what was supposedly going to happen ended up happening in that case for sure.
I think this is all really important, and I think it's very significant. I want to give you a couple more clips on it. Here is sports journalist Carrie Champion. She was on CNN yesterday.
The end racism in the end zones and lift every voice and sing clearly tells me that they haven't been in touch with anybody in the culture of the community or any marginalized group of people to have any real significant change. That's not what you do. You don't sing and you don't put end racism in the end zone so that you can make a change.
And here's my old friend, sports journalist LZ Granderson on ABC News, making some great points.
When we have been having this conversation for 20 years, like, how do they even rationalize saying that, knowing that they had to put a rule in just to interview us to begin with? How is diversity a core value? You just got your first openly gay player. How is diversity a core value? Dave Capet came out in the 70s. You just got your first openly gay one this season. So diversity can't be your core value. Diversity is something that you say to get people off your back, that you're working on things. We'll put on a decal. We'll put in end racism in our end zone, because at the end of the day, we're too popular of a sport to actually be held accountable. The ratings for these past playoff games were double-digit jumps in terms of viewership. The NFL just signed a multi-billion-dollar broadcasting rights deal that was twice the amount of the previous deal. So the owners know all of this. They know they don't have to change. And so we're having these conversations about the hiring practices and what needs to happen. And they can talk about diversity being a core factor. But the reality is that we don't see that in terms of hiring and in leadership. You just got over the fact that you didn't want a black person to be a quarterback. That was recent. So what really is a sham, Diane, is this notion that the NFL ownership group are sincere in these statements.
All right, LZ Granderson. I should probably reach out to him and get him on. I'm going to put on the whiteboard. How about that? Okay, let me switch gears slightly, still on the issue of race. I found this India Ari clip, and she's a very talented and brilliant artist, of course, musician, songwriter. And I just love what she had to say here. I loved all of what she had to say here. And what else can I tell you? This is, of course, about the whole Joe Rogan Spotify thing. She's taken her music off, and she explains why. And I thought it was very vulnerable and honest and powerful. India Ari.
Yes, I decided to pull my music and my podcast from Spotify, but it's dual. One is the Joe Rogan conversation, and for me, his language around race and some of the things I've seen and heard But also, coupled with that, there is the treatment of artists by Spotify. And so artists are underpaid, and Joe Rogan gets paid all this money. And it's hard for me to, these days, just sit back and go, oh, well, that's how it goes. I made a commitment with myself after reading this book by Martha Beck called The Way of Integrity. She challenges the reader to an integrity cleanse, and it means telling the whole truth all the time and see what it will make of your life. And so I've been doing that since maybe around May. And so when this came up, I had to do it. And I'm a little bit nervous about it because I know people are going to conflate the conversations, and some people are going to judge me, and they're going to say it's not my business, and, you know, all these things, because it is a little bit of a different reason than Joni and Neil. But also it's my truth, and it's not always my job to educate people about how I feel. Although I try, I know that my truth is mine. And so I am working to have it pulled down.
All right, there you go. India Ari on the Tamron Hall show. I should have mentioned that. Laura Coates is on the Tamron Hall show. You should watch that interview if you get a chance. All right, now let's move on to a different issue, this being the issue of Russia still looking like it's about to invade Ukraine. And here is former National Security Council Director Fiona Hill testifying yesterday in Washington about the crisis in Ukraine and how it's been manufactured by Vladimir Putin himself.
The current phase of this crisis in Ukraine has been manufactured by Russian President Vladimir Putin in the Kremlin. And I think for all of us, it's quite difficult to identify a specific trigger for the decision to build up forces to such an extent on the borders close to Ukraine, or to suddenly escalate events in December of last year. In many respects, the timing seems driven more by Vladimir Putin's own political predilections and perceptions of developments, rather than by events on the ground in Ukraine or in the contested Donbass region.
All right, Fiona Hill testifying yesterday. All right, what else have I got for you here? This is from the Recount. They do these great kind of mashups showing the hypocrisy of politicians. And this is the governor of Texas, Greg Abbott. Last in November, he said, remember Texas lost the power for days and Ted Cruz tried to go to Cancun. Remember that? Last winter. Well, Greg Abbott said back in November, I can guarantee the lights will stay on. And now with this imminent major storm about to rock the whole country, it would seem, Greg Abbott saying, I don't know, no one can guarantee the lights stay on. Here it is from the Recount.
Can you give a guarantee that the lights are going to stay on?
I can guarantee the lights will stay on.
Well, listen, no one can guarantee that there won't be a, quote, load shed event. But what we will work and strive to achieve, and what we're prepared to achieve, is that the power is going to stay on across the entire state.
Okay, so he says the power is going to stay on. Does that mean the lights will stay on? I'm confused. I mean, he was later asked, is there a technicality? Will you be using torches? How will you be keeping the lights on if there's no electricity? Will you have batteries? What's the deal, Governor? So that's stupid. I hope the lights stay on for all our friends in Texas. And apparently that stupid groundhog saw his shadow or didn't see his shadow, but he saw his shadow. So there's going to be 6 more weeks of winter. Here's this stupid operation, this dumb tradition in Pennsylvania.
Of the true believers from around the world. Woo! I lost my space.
Oh my God, he lost his space. He's got one thing to read.
I bask in the warmth of your hearts. I couldn't imagine a better fate. With my shadow I have cast than a long, lustrous 6 more weeks of winter.
I mean, goddamn, that is a stupid thing.
What's your reaction, Jen?
A bunch of stupid guys, a bunch of dumb old white guys with beards and their hats, and they got the top hat, and this guy doesn't even know the script. What a train wreck. And I hate groundhogs also. Of all of nature's creations, groundhog may be my least favorite. All right, it's garden related. It's not his fault. It's my fault, and I'm sorry. Yesterday was 2/2/22. Did you see that, by the way? I didn't pick up on that until after the show yesterday. That's cool. I hope it brought you great luck. All right, one more thing I want to play for you, and this is really outrageous and offensive and triggering, so take a breath, take a beat. I mean, maybe the guy isn't being real in this clip, but his name is Jason Whitlock. Some of you are probably familiar with him. He's a pretty well-known commentator, black guy who's a sports commentator, and he's on Tucker Carlson, Fox Nation. I mentioned he's a black guy because there's a lot of issues surrounding race and racism. I mean, a lot of black folks. The black folks I know, like, follow, respect, and friends with, don't like him. Put it that way. Anyway, Jason Whitlock joins Tucker Carlson on his Fox Nation show, and he discussed his views on women and women in leadership. And I don't know. I mean, do you know people who really believe this stuff? I've always believed that sexism, the root of sexism, is in the kind of religious, biblical worldviews that many people have, and it stems from. And he really confirms this. Like, he really gives it the full confirmation. And it's real upsetting, but I think it might generate a conversation with folks. And I'd like to hear what you think about it. Anyway, here he is, Jason Whitlock on Tucker Carlson being a horribly sexist prick.
But I probably am a sexist pig, so I could care less if I'm called that. But the patriarchy is a good thing.
Oh,
it's what God intended.
Oh,
men are supposed to lead. Men are supposed to be out front, taking risks. We're responsible. I have some ministers on my show every Wednesday, and we talk about it all the time. And again, this if you have a biblical worldview. In the garden, Adam and Eve, when things go haywire, God shows up and calls out, Adam, where are you at? Hey, basically he says, excuse my language, shit ain't right here. Adam, what are you doing? I left you in charge. And God is looking down at us right now, at men, and just, what are you doing?
I mean, maybe, by the way, did anybody think that was a sign that he shouldn't have left a man in charge? I mean, that was my first assumption. Why did he leave the guy in charge? Why didn't he leave Eve in charge? I don't even know this story. And the version he's telling seems slightly offensive, and I don't even care about this shit.
Why are you laying down? Why are you pretending that Hillary Clinton, Kamala Harris, Stacey Abrams, that they can save us?
Oh, okay. I see where he's going.
They can save this world. This is lunacy. It out of her role completely. And I'm sorry if that paints me as a sexist pig, but it's what I believe.
Well, that's just an epithet designed to make you be quiet. But I guess I wonder.
No, it's not an epithet. What? What? How is that even a reaction? How is that possible? Well, to be fair, that's probably Tucker Carlson's reaction to anybody who says something horrifically out of step with modern society.
I wonder why is that? Why are you not allowed to have that opinion? Why?
You're allowed to have that opinion. You sure can have that opinion. That's you can have that opinion. Just good luck with the ladies. I mean, if you could find someone that wants to be with you or work with you, but you can't have that opinion in the workplace. You would be fired because it would make every woman there feel inferior. You stupid fuck.
Why is that so controversial? That was the
God damn, you're stupid. Or not, you're not stupid. You know exactly what you're doing. What am I saying?
The opinion of every society, like from the beginning of time until about 20 minutes ago. So
no.
Social media, and we've talked about this when I first started coming on your show, social media decides what's allowable thinking. And
no, this was not allowable thinking in 1980. I mean, come on, the kind of shit that he just said. Ridiculous.
And social media has decided you can't second guess anything the left is in support of.
No, social media did not decide that women couldn't lead. It's just so stupid. What am I doing?
Or you're some kind of sexist pig. You're some kind of transphobic. You're some kind of homophobic. You're racist. you're a sellout, and social media is like the editor-in-chief. Social media is the editor of the New York Times. It's the editor of...
Okay, well, I think we've heard enough from Jason Whitlock. But I guess I'm a bit naive, a little bit of a prude, a bit ignorant. I'm not that familiar with him. But I hope that'll start a conversation with folks. And I'll try to remember to bring that up at tonight's Hangout as well. All right, that's all the audio I've got for you on the last 24, but I do have a whole bunch more headlines coming up right now in the news dump. Hit it, Pete Co.
Sisters of Life sledding nuns, see them shout and jump to the baptism they cried on today's news dump.
Yes, Pete Co. Thank you very much. That's a story about nuns who like to go sledding in the snow. And Sisters of Life, the nunnery, I guess, and they were riding their sleds around in Central Park in New York City, and so the New York Post wrote a story about them. Who becomes a nun at this point? 2022. Speaking of religion, who are these? I would like to interview them. What brought them into that world? Okay, so moving on, I've got some other very important stories to share with you. Let's start with, I have a lot of good news stories. First of all, I did mention there'll be 6 more weeks of winter, according to that stupid groundhog, so that's not a thing, but fun to say over and over. This is not good news, but important to mention. I'll get to the good news. Suicides by drug overdose increased among youth, elderly, and black women in the last 5 years, according to a new study. Documenting suicide rates can be very challenging, of course, but it's hard to determine if an overdose was intentional or not, for example. But in 2020, nearly 90,000 people died from drug overdoses in the U.S., the largest increase in a calendar year. And so this is a study from the American Journal of Psychiatry, if you want to look into it. Here's the good news, more than 70 Confederate monuments were removed or renamed in 2021, according to a new report from the Southern Poverty Law Center. That's good news. That's progress. We'll take it. Taking down the Confederates. Bad news. The senator, one of the Democratic senators from New Mexico, Senator Ben Ray Lujan is his name. Lujan or Lujan, is expected to return to the Senate, but not for 46 weeks because he had a stroke. Barring complications after suffering a stroke, he'll be back, but the news of his potential return comes after his staff announced on Thursday he'd been hospitalized after suffering the stroke last week. Expected to make a full recovery, which is good, but in a 50-50 Senate, his time away threatens to leave Democrats' agenda in limbo until he returns. So, really important. This is the scenario that Democrats, progressives are worried about, and here it is. But hopefully he'll be back in time to cast his vote to confirm Joe Biden's secretary or his nominee for the Supreme Court. California's granted $45 million to build housing to tackle homelessness. I think that's a really important development. New Zealand planning to reopen their border after new COVID-19 restrictions are implemented. I think that's also good news. And more. Here's more good news. Louisiana, the state of Louisiana, has decided they're going to move to net zero emissions by 2050 in a state's first climate plan. State officials pledged to lower emissions to net zero by the year 2050. Of course, Louisiana will be underwater at that point, so it won't matter, but still, at least they're saying that and not denying climate change in an oil state like Louisiana. And more good news. How about this? Americans' views on overall quality of life have ticked up, according to a new poll. Gallup poll released Tuesday found that 69% of respondents reported being satisfied with overall quality of life, up from 67% when the poll asked the same question in 2021. And finally, folks, heavy snow and ice storm plastering the Midwest, the Mid-South. Travel could be impossible. Thousands of flights. I think 5,000 flights have been canceled. A major winter storm delivering a wintry mess to more than 90 million Americans. From New Mexico to Maine, ice storm warnings covering parts of Mississippi and Tennessee valleys where upward of an inch of glaze will bring down trees and power lines and render travel virtually impossible. Cities, including Dallas, Memphis, and Little Rock, are likely to experience ice storm conditions, facing potential outages late Wednesday into Thursday. while regions further north will pick up heavy snow. And so you probably have the forecast at this point. I'm not going to be a weatherman. I just want to know. I hope you're safe. I know many of us will be affected by this, and we're here for you. So if you need any support, any help, let us know. There's probably somebody in your area, in our community, that'd be happy to connect. And that is today's news dump, ladies and gentlemen, brought to you by Truebill, truebill.com/standup. Go check it out right now. Save money on all those subscriptions you forgot you're paying for. Truebill.com/standup right now. Save money, help the show, do it now. All right, well, it's time to get to my first and only guest on today's episode of Stand Up. She is a virologist who has like 17 different degrees. She is now working at a lab in Canada, even though she's from Seattle, but was working at Columbia University in New York before that. It's all kind of confusing, her background, but she is smart, as you will find out. She's a virologist who studies what she calls the endless, fascinating struggle between host and pathogen, using a combination of classic virological techniques and systems biology to study the host response to viral infection and how it causes disease. She studied everything from SARS to Ebola to so much more, and I learned so much in my conversation with Dr. Angie Rasmussen, who is a great communicator and a really cool person who I'm so psyched to get to know and have on the show and have a conversation with and be able to use as a resource. And she also said she would join us at one of our hangouts sometime soon. So she's on Twitter and very active and a huge following on Twitter at Angie_Rasmussen. I demand that you go and let her know that you heard her on the show after you listen to the conversation. I think you're really going to want to. So let's do it, Angie. Dr. Angie Rasmussen for the first time on Stand Up. All right, I've just told you all about her. I'm very excited that she's joining me for the first time on the podcast. She's super smart and brilliant. She has 400 different degrees, and she's now working and living in Canada for some reason. Dr. Angela Rasmussen, welcome to Stand Up. Thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Pete.
So, yeah, why did you move? You're American, and you moved all the way to Saskatchewan for what?
Yeah, so this is something that I actually 2 years ago never would have imagined myself doing. At the time, before the pandemic, I was on the faculty at the Columbia Mailman School of Public Health, but my family actually lived in Seattle. So I was commuting bi-coastally back and forth between New York and Seattle and maintaining homes in both cities, which has its own drawbacks. As great as Seattle is, it's my home city. Actually, technically Puyallup is, but Seattle's the one that everybody knows. And New York, I went to graduate school there. I love New York. But that cross-country commute wasn't working even before the pandemic.
Yikes.
So when the pandemic happened, and that kind of really trapped me in Seattle for a long period of time, because I couldn't do the traveling back and forth, I started looking for other positions that would be suitable for both me and my family to live and work there. And it just so happened that a colleague of mine from Canada told me about Vito, where I work now, and said that they were having a faculty search. So I applied for the job and learned a little bit more about the institution. And it really is a world-class institution with an incredible BSL-3 lab, as well as they're recruiting a number of really, really inspirational colleagues. So it was a surprise to me that I would end up moving to Saskatoon, where I had never been before I actually moved here. But it has turned out to be really the right move. And I think the moral of the story here is that life takes a lot of unexpected twists and turns. You just got to go with it.
Well, we've all learned that over the past couple of years. Boy, I mean, what's been more demonstrative of that principle than a pandemic, which you had studied your entire career. Your bio says that you're a virologist. Does everybody struggle with it a little bit, the pronunciation? A virologist.
I have heard virologist before.
So you study the struggle between the host and the virus, the pathogen. You use a combination of classic virological techniques and systems biology to study the host response to viral infection and how it causes disease. I think that's a pretty basic way of explaining the science that you do. So what is it that you're specifically doing at this new lab?
Yeah, so I work right now primarily on SARS coronavirus 2, just like most of my colleagues. But I am getting back to the viruses that I studied before the pandemic. So MERS coronavirus, influenza virus, and Ebola virus. And really what I study for all of them is I essentially use different model systems, either cells in the lab or animals that have been deliberately infected. And you look to see how those systems respond to infection. So most people know that a virus hijacks its host cell when it infects it to further its own replication. Sometimes that also results in basically getting rid of or interfering with the body's defense systems against those viruses. And that's what can lead to causing disease for most of these viruses. Ebola and SARS coronavirus 2, actually, there's a lot of things they don't have in common, but there are some things that they do. And one of which is that severe disease for both is caused by a dysfunctional host response to the infection. So basically your response to the infection, your antiviral systems that you have in place get all screwed up. And that leads to this cascade that causes wild, out of control inflammation. And that's actually what causes severe disease for both viruses, either Ebola virus disease or COVID-19.
Inflammation of, in this case.
So this is what's different between the two of them. For Ebola, it's systemic inflammation. So imagine the inflammatory response, which is actually really helpful. A lot of people hear inflammation, they think that's bad.
Oh, I certainly did.
Inflammation is associated with injury. But inflammation is actually a really critical part of the response to infection. So inflammation just means that all of these different immune cells and these immune chemicals are being secreted in the spot where the infection is occurring. And that leads the immune system to actually go to that site and clear the infection. When that happens uncontrolled, however, when that happens systemically, so in Ebola, that happens throughout the entire body. And when it's not specific, it's not targeted, it can be hugely damaging to the entire body. The same thing happens in COVID-19, but the details of how that happens are a little bit different. And with COVID-19, we're learning a lot more about the other organ systems that it affects. But what everybody knows is that it does impact the lungs profoundly. And that's what causes the severe acute respiratory syndrome that SARS coronavirus 2 and SARS classic are both named after.
You said everybody knows a couple times, and I'm not sure who everybody you're talking to, but certainly the reason that you give interviews to people like me and major media outlets is to educate folks. And what I think, depending on who you're talking about, you may be giving folks too much credit, because I just want to go back a step to just the idea that a lot of people don't realize that viruses evolve. They are the most interesting and fascinating, if not so deadly, example of evolution, a virus mutating. And I think a lot of the folks who are kind of anti-science or ignorant or think they know one thing or something because they looked up on Google, they keep saying, oh, the government's rolling out another variant. And I just want to scream, this is evolution. Could you just say a word or two to just explain to the general audience as to how these variants are really mutations that are demonstrating how all living things mutate and evolve?
Yeah, that's a great point. This is where everybody knows kind of falls flat.
Yeah.
So I think everybody knows that mutation exists. I think everybody knows about evolution, whether they believe in it or not. But the variants are a great example of evolution in action happening right before our very eyes. Now, we can't really see human evolution taking place because we reproduce, a couple times in our lifetimes, which are measured in decades. But viruses, their lifetimes, or lifetimes in quotes, because some people argue that viruses aren't even alive, they're measured in hours. So they can reproduce regularly. So viruses can replicate themselves many, many times just in the course of hours or a couple days. And that provides a higher rate at which mutations can occur. So I think one thing that people are very confused about with mutation is the idea that mutation is an intentional process, or that it's a directed process, or that viruses want something, that they're evolving to suit their own desires or their own goals. And that's just not true. Actually, mutation is a completely random process. So here's how it works. The viral polymerase, which is the enzyme that copies the virus's genome, that's how it replicates, makes mistakes. and it makes more mistakes than the enzyme that copies our genomes that are made of DNA, where the virus's genome is made of a chemical called RNA that's similar, but a little bit different.
Right.
So it makes all these mistakes, and you can think of it as somebody typing. It makes more typos than a human would when it's copying its genetic material. Now, humans also are working with a newer version of a word processor that has a spell check. The viruses, RNA viruses, like SARS coronavirus 2, don't have that same spell check mechanism. Now, coronaviruses actually do have sort of a partial spell check, and I won't get too much into that, but they still have a much higher mutation rate than people. Now, this is only important. This is not important if you have a small self-contained epidemic or outbreak, because if something's going to spread and then it's going to be contained, the virus can't replicate anymore, no more mutation, no more evolution.
Got it.
But SARS coronavirus 2, unfortunately, has had all of these opportunities to make all of these different typos. And every once in a while, you're bound to get a typo that actually makes for a better sentence. And that's what the variants of concern are. They're these mutations that occur by random chance. And because we've given the virus so many chances to make these mutations, eventually we've selected for variants that are better at virusing, if you want to use that term. They're better at virusing, making new viruses than their predecessors. And we see this happening over and over again. This will continue to happen as long as transmission remains out of control and unchecked.
Do you think that scientists and the journalists who report on scientists have communicated well enough to the general public, or what is your opinion of how they've communicated in terms of, again, I kind of bring everything back to my community Facebook page, which is filled with people who are not scientists and not educated in science, and including me. But the idea that things shift so much, the idea that is as many credentials as you have, as long as you've been studying this, Angie, you can't tell me what is about to happen. You're unable to predict what is about to happen. You're using all of the research you have to kind of do the best you can, but it keeps changing. We keep hearing different things, and I think that it's not been communicated well enough, and I'm not sure how to do it, to help the public understand that scientists are doing as good of work they can, and so are maybe journalists, but depending on who you listen to, I suppose. But it's hard to predict these things, even with all of the research and tools that you have. And that's, I think, what the public wants more than anything else, is more predictions, accurate predictions, and less uncertainty. What is your thoughts on that?
I mean, I completely agree with you. And I think in terms of my own communication, this is the one thing I think about all the time. Partly because I have a lot of people on Twitter who, I remember in January of 2020, I tweeted at one point that everybody should get their flu shot because flu is a much bigger issue for people right now than at the time it was called novel coronavirus 2019. Now, that was in, again, mid-January of 2020. At the time, there were fewer than 10 known cases of SARS coronavirus 2 in the US. So that was a perfectly valid thing to tweet. Now, 2 weeks later, I had a different opinion, but all I hear now is you said this, you were wrong. And I think that communicating that uncertainty, that scientists are trained really to try to prove themselves wrong and to change their hypotheses in the face of emerging data, that's really, really challenging to communicate to people. And ultimately, I think it comes down to trust as well. People look at your so-called track record, and if you were wrong about something, they're going to say, well, she's not quite as trustworthy as, my neighbor on Facebook who's saying this. I trust them more than this fancy doctor with all these degrees who isn't even right all the time. I think it's really tremendously challenging trying to communicate that to people and to help them sort of lean into this uncertainty, to know that we live in an uncertain world. And science itself is just trying to make that uncertainty a little bit more certain, but it can never come up with all of the answers. I think even the way that, science has been depicted in the media, in the popular press. I mean, I joke all the time, and I have been since graduate school, about how nice it would be if I could just, pop something into a machine, press a button, and get the answer to the question I was asking, which is often how this is depicted in TV shows and movies, that sort of thing. But that's not how it works at all. And usually we very rarely get a result that's absolutely certain, or maybe not rarely, but certainly not all the time. I mean, a lot of times you get results from a given experiment that are even more confusing than the question you set out to ask. Yeah. And so one big thing that we do in science is we're constantly not only trying to prove ourselves wrong, but we're trying to make sense out of data that often is conflicting and contradictory. And it's just tremendously, tremendously difficult trying to communicate that to the public, especially when everybody's sick to death of this pandemic and everybody wants some answers now.
So well said. So well said. And I wish people would listen to that type of answer and understand the culture and incentives that scientists have, why they do what they do. It wasn't in your case to gain a major public following, which amongst the people who do what you do, you have a massive following on Twitter, like 330,000 people following you. What do you think? Why are you using social media and how has it been effective or ineffective? And why are you such a big deal? What was your big break?
I have no idea, honestly. I mean, I've gotten big jumps of followers and stuff. Usually it's been when there's been some sort of Twitter fight, or a couple of times I just lost it and like cussed out Donald Trump. And I think that I definitely sometimes wear my emotions on my sleeve, and I'm not afraid to swear, and I have some spicy takes. So I assume that some of my followers are for that. I think people use Twitter for a lot of different reasons. And certainly I have a lot of people who hate follow me too. And they're not shy about letting me know that either. But I think
would you mind just giving people a taste of what you get on a, regular basis? Threats, name calling, anything?
I mean, I get a lot of name calling. A lot of people, call me stupid. They call me fat. They call me a bitch. They call me ugly. They call me pretty much everything that you can be called on the internet. That's fine. I mean, it's not fine, but it's par for the course. And I think that even people who don't have large followings experience this. There's just a lot. And, Twitter is built for acrimony.
Yeah.
The algorithms on Twitter, and I find this very interesting. The algorithms, and this may be why actually I have so many followers, is because I'm not shy about calling out what I see as misinformation and specifically bad actors, because there are really a lot of people who are doing harm to people, but are also making a lot of money from it. And, I'm not afraid to call that out, but the algorithm in Twitter does prioritize drama, for lack of a better word. So if you're getting into some sort of confrontation with somebody, and especially if it's getting nasty, people like to show up to watch with their popcorn. And I think that does get a lot of followers. It encourages conversations that aren't always the most productive. So I keep this in mind, and that's not why I joined social media, though. When I started Twitter in like 2011, but when the pandemic started, I had 250 followers, something like that. And really, I just started using it because I was trying to keep up with all the literature that was coming out at the very beginning of the pandemic, since I did study MERS coronavirus, and I was interested, obviously, in emerging viruses, and that's what I study. I thought that if I wasn't able to be in the lab because Columbia was shut down and I was stuck in Seattle anyways, then at least I could, tweet about some of these papers and stuff that were coming out, because there were some really bad preprints very early on.
Yeah,
there was
thank
one
God
that said it probably came from snakes and it was an HIV hybrid and stuff. So I just started tweeting about that, thinking that if this was so difficult for me to sort through all this crap, then imagine how it's going to be for the average person. And it just kind of went from there.
Well, I think that your work on social media, it might sound too much, but I think it's heroic. I think you and colleagues and people who do what you do, many of which I've interviewed and gotten to know, are doing such important work. Clearly, I would imagine the most important work in many ways of your lifetime. You probably didn't think you were going to have to be so public in communicating this stuff or debunking stuff and constantly being there. But given your background and given your scholarship and experience, you're uniquely suited for it. And it's ugly, and it can be even dangerous. I'm good friends with Peter Hotez. He's certainly been out front and has received so many threats. And God forbid you're a woman or Jewish or a minority of any way, they'll come for that, of course. But let me get back to one more issue that is somewhat controversial. It does seem you got a lot of attention when you wrote a piece and talked a little bit about the origins of the pandemic. And my question is, you are working with live viruses, right, in that lab in your special suit, and it is deadly and dangerous and poses a dangerous threat to the world. And so there's this question about the ethical basis of that kind of research being done. There's this phrase that a lot of people have learned for the very first time and all think they're experts on, gain of function, and Rand Paul versus Anthony Fauci. There is, though, a question about it within your community in terms of how it should be done and who should do it and the security around it. And in the past, we've seen there hasn't been enough security around it. What would you say about the research that you're doing with these dangerous viruses and why you have to do it, or why you think it's important, what you think about that controversy?
Yeah, absolutely. Now, this is, I think, probably Origins COVID Twitter is probably the most toxic.
Oh, really?
Hive of scum and villainy out there next to maybe anti-vax Twitter. But no, let me explain this, because I think that the popular perception, and as you put, everybody's now learned this term gain of function, the popular perception of what it's like to work in a containment lab and what it's like to do virology research, period, is, I think, really, really misunderstood. And I think this would really help a lot if people did understand this. So first of all, I don't do gain of function research. Now, very few people actually do gain of function research in the sense that's being discussed here. So gain of function is actually a term that just means that you're doing some kind of molecular biology that results in a gain of some type of function. Could be anything. Could be you're taking a fly and making its wings better. That's actually the term gain of function came out of Drosophila genetics, which is studying fruit flies to understand how genetics works. So a lot of gain of function research isn't what we're talking about here. What we're talking about here is what the federal government calls P3, or pathogens of pandemic. God, I have to look up what P3 means again. Pete, delete this part. Pathogens of pandemic potential. That's what it stands for. I don't know. I just had a little brain fart there.
I was going to say it's a protable protein pack, but that's just the first hit I got on Google. Right. So I'm a genius.
It's pathogens of pandemic potential, and gain of function work in this context is referred to EP3 or EPPP, enhanced pathogens of pandemic potential. This specifically means taking a pathogen that already is potentially dangerous for people and making it better at being a pathogen. So either making it more pathogenic and or more transmissible is usually what we're talking about. I have never done that type of research. I don't make viruses better at what they do. I actually study viruses that are already pretty good at causing disease in people and trying to understand how they do that. So I want to make it very clear that the vast majority of virology research that's occurring in containment is not so-called gain of function research. It is trying to understand these pathogens and how they cause disease so that we can develop countermeasures like vaccines, therapeutics, et cetera.
Yeah.
Now, the origins pandemic research in question is very difficult to pin down what people are even talking about, because there's so many different so-called lab leak hypotheses. There's, they were out sampling bats in a cave and they weren't wearing sufficient personal protective equipment and somebody got accidentally infected and brought it back to Wuhan. Or, they got a virus from these activities, sampling bats in the wild. They brought it back to the Wuhan Institute of Virology. They were growing this virus in culture, which, by the way, is extremely difficult to do, especially if your starting material is a big piece of bat shit. But they have done it a couple times. They've published on that. They were growing it, and then there was some kind of spill in the lab. Somebody got infected and went out into the public and started spreading it around. Or they were doing gain of function research, and they were engineering things into these bat coronaviruses that made them worse. So far, there is exactly zero evidence that any of those things ever happened. And in fact, there is more, and circumstantial, but there's more circumstantial evidence piling up on the side that this was the result of zoonotic spillover, specifically from the wildlife trade that was also occurring in Wuhan at the same time. We can continue to debate this, and I think that we probably will, because Unfortunately, the only way that we're ever going to get any clarity on this is if the Chinese government releases some information about either what was going on at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, or better yet, the sequences of the environmental samples that were collected at the Wuhan seafood market. There is certainly evidence that could provide more clarity, but we don't have access to it.
I mean, I don't know.
Very few people do in China.
It doesn't seem like anybody will ever get it. Why would, unless it were leaked somehow by the Chinese or, obtained through other measures, espionage or hacks or something. I mean, we're never going to know. But the question for someone like you is, how much does it matter, the origin? I mean, you study something called spillback, right? Where the virus gets into animals. I'm suspecting mammals. I don't know, but I've heard about the white-tailed deer thing, which sounds like a lot of fun. But this is something that you study, and this is something that I think scientists obviously want to understand, how a virus travels from different species to other species, so that we can obviously be prepared and prevent it, because there's a lot that happens while it's got a new host living in a beautiful buck behind my house.
Yeah, so let me finish up one thing really quick before I get to that, but That's a really important point. Let me just say one last thing about origins, and this gets to your question. So why do we need to understand the origins of this virus? Why does it matter where it came from? Well, in terms of biosafety, I do want people to know that while there are still some steps that we need to take, I think, for biosafety internationally, and that is specifically, we need to have some kind of international agreement on how biosafety standards are going to be regulated and enforced.
Sure.
In the US, in Canada, everywhere I've ever worked, biosafety is governed by federal law. And the labs that we work in are incredibly safe. That's not to say that accidents don't happen, but it makes a lab leak very unlikely in a place like the US. And the main reason for that is that, well, first of all, we could go to jail if we handle certain pathogens incorrectly. And second of all, why do you think virologists don't want there to be a lab leak that's a result of a lab accident?
Right.
Who do you think is going to be the first person that gets infected with that virus? Right. It's going to be the virologist. And I have to say, I don't want to get SARS-2 any more than I want to get Ebola or any of the other viruses that I work with. So we do have some ways to go with biosafety, but it's not the Wild West where people are out there wearing, whatever PPE they can get a hold of and just, making chimeric viruses all the time with zero oversight. Now, does that matter for origins? Not really. Now, origins don't matter at all in terms of our ability to stop this pandemic. We already know what needs to be done to stop the pandemic.
Right.
Vaccinate more people. We need to apply non-pharmaceutical interventions like masks and social distancing and capacity limits in the meantime to get prevalence down. None of that requires that we know where this virus came from. But the reason we do need to know about origins, and I think this is what people really should be thinking about when they hear about this stuff, is we need to be thinking about the next pandemic. So if this did result from zoonotic transmission, and honestly, even if it didn't, zoonotic transmission remains the biggest risk. And that is relevant to spillback as well, because spillover is just when that happens for the first time. When a virus comes out of its animal reservoir, gets into the human population, and goes crazy. Spillback is just when it goes back into animals and then comes back into humans again. So we need to be thinking about all of those things. And that means we need to be thinking about how we interact with the natural world, how we're moving around the globe, how we're interacting with each other, and how we're using the land and using the animals that live on it. I think that is going to be, in the future, the biggest risk of novel viruses emerging. And my biggest fear, the thing that keeps me up at night, is that the next pandemic is not going to be a coronavirus. It's going to be something like Nipah virus that's transmissible by the respiratory route that has a case fatality rate of 30%. Now, I don't want everybody to think that this is inevitable, but this is a possibility. And the longer we sit around talking about lab leaks and all these hypothetical things, the less we're actually paying attention to the number one source of viruses, the number one gain of function practitioner that's out there, and that's Mother Nature.
Well, how much of Mother Nature, though, is synthesized through commercial farming? It would seem that cattle farmers, I guess chicken farmers, anybody who raises animals are pretty supportive of vaccines. Although I did see a really interesting video once where a cattle farmer was inoculated all of the head of his cattle, but not himself and his own family members. So it's like he understands that vaccines work because he vaccinates all those animals. Anyway, the question is, what about all these animals that we are farming and growing in here in America and maybe in other countries that have less safe restrictions, guidelines, and laws around it? Is that what you're also talking about when you say Mother Nature? How likely are viruses to come from the animals that we're raising to eat?
Yeah, so that's exactly what I mean. And when I say, how we use the land, how we use natural resources, certainly animals are one of those natural resources. And we already know that factory farms and farms in general, actually, including farms that are smaller in scale, but keep animals in the same conditions where they're close together, potentially with a lot of other species at the same time. We already know that, for example, influenza can become adapted to grow better in people that way. So we know that pigs, for example, can become infected with influenza from birds or from humans. It can circulate in the pigs and in that way become more human adapted, get into those pig workers. We've also seen that people who work at farms where animals are raised have been infected with some of those viruses. We see this all the time with influenza. We also have seen this in terms of at least antibodies for viruses that are a lot scarier, like Reston virus, which has been found in some pig workers in the Philippines, or pig farmers in the Philippines. Reston virus is an Ebola virus. It's what the book The Hot Zone was about. And so far, it doesn't seem like it causes disease in people. But if that's happening with one Ebola virus, couldn't that happen just as easily with another? So absolutely, I'm not saying we should stop farming meat. I do eat meat. I wear leather, and I use animal products. I'm not saying that we should stop that entirely, but we do need to be thinking about how we actually do this. Certainly, operations where a lot of animals are kept together in extremely close quarters are not great. They're bad for a whole host of other reasons too. They breed antibiotic resistance, which is a huge problem coming down the pipe for us. That's not my specialty, but these types of farming operations are a great example of how we really do need to be thinking about how we use the resources, the natural resources at our disposal, and how we interact with the natural world and the ecosystems that we're a part of.
Yeah, I love talking to you. I'm learning so much. I'm so excited by the idea that how much people are going to learn when they hear this conversation. One quick question and then a lightning round for you, Doctor, which is the one question is I think I'm susceptible to this criticism or argument, not of Dr. Anthony Fauci per se, but of anybody in his position or anybody at NIH. If you are the main funding or funder, government funder, which I guess is the main funder of scientific research at NIH, do scientists not want to necessarily criticize by name, using their own name and calling out other scientists' names, because there would be some consequences in terms of their future funding, their career? Is that I'm susceptible a little bit to that. Nobody wants to criticize Fauci or some of these other well-known scientists that are, because they don't want their funding to be somehow reeled back. The idea that could take place is bizarre to me, that someone, a Fauci or any others would somehow carry out a vendetta like a Trump might based on funding is a bit bizarre and probably doesn't sound realistic. But I hear that a lot, and I want to, get your take on it.
Yeah, so I think that those people definitely don't understand the way that NIH funds are dispersed. So Tony Fauci, to be clear, doesn't sit down and look at every single grant that is funded by NIAID, the institute that he runs. It is a huge institute with a multi-billion-dollar budget, and he simply wouldn't have enough time to personally sign off or say, hey, I don't like the PI on this grant, so I'm not going to award it. To my knowledge, the only time I can think of that somebody's had a grant arbitrarily stripped from, an NIH grant that was arbitrarily stripped was and I hate to even bring this up, but it was EcoHealth Alliance's R01 grant that Donald Trump found out they were, giving a subcontract to the Wuhan Institute of Virology, and immediately stripped the grant in April of 2020. That's the only case I've ever heard of in which somebody has had a grant capriciously stopped right then. So Tony Fauci, certainly there's a perception that you don't want to piss off Tony Fauci, and I guess I can understand why, but I've never actually heard of anybody suffering because they publicly criticized Tony Fauci or another NIH official. And I personally have, to Francis Collins's face, criticized him and NIH and the way they do things on other matters, on how they handle cases of sexual harassment, for example, within NIH.
Oh.
And it has not hurt my career. Now, I can understand, though, again, why people are reluctant, especially junior people, to criticize high-up people. And I would say that the one solution to this that NIH should consider is potentially being a little bit more transparent about how they make funding decisions. Because the way that grants are given is you submit a grant, it's a miserable, arduous process that sucks, and nobody likes it. It's just a necessary evil in our business. It's lousy. It takes a lot of time. You submit that grant, it goes to NIH. They review it to make sure that you've checked all the right boxes in terms of the grant submission format. Then it goes to a study section. And that's a bunch of your peers that will read the grant, rip it apart, provide criticisms, and provide it with a score.
Right.
Then it will go to council. That's a whole other separate group of people that will say, of all these grants that got scored and were discussed, here's the ones that are above the pay line, which is getting smaller every year as the NIH budget shrinks. And they will say, these grants for sure we're going to fund because they got a good enough score. These grants down here, they're kind of right on the edge. And then there is a little bit of discretion where the program officer can decide which grants are more worthy of funding than others because of usually because of scientific priorities. But it's not Tony Fauci that makes that decision either. This is way down the chain from
and
Tony
no
Fauci.
one. And furthermore, I can't imagine anything could get funded by having one person look at it and sign off. I'm sure there are boards of people who peer review and before funding is decided upon. It's not like some guy sitting on a pile of cash that says, you get to study this virus, you get to study that. Come on.
That's right. So that's council, that's study sections. There's also scientific review panels that the NIH convenes. And there's program officers. These are sort of agnostic people that work for NIH and administer those funds.
Yeah, you just said a bunch of words. I don't know what they were, but it's obviously true.
It takes a village.
Exactly. Thank you. All right, lightning round. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
Okay, I just basically say a word or a person, and you say whatever you want about it because I'm not smart enough to know what the best question about such person or subject is to ask you, so you can just take it however you want.
Just a real quick question. Can I swear?
We encourage it.
Okay. Excellent.
And since that's the case, let me just throw out Aaron Rodgers, Joe Rogan.
Fucking idiots.
And you're a football fan.
I'm a football fan. I'm a Seahawks fan, so never the biggest Aaron Rodgers fan to begin with, but I will point out that the Seahawks did have the 100% vaccination rate this year.
You don't have to lightning around your answer. It can be succinct so I can get to other words, but just a little bit more. Elaborate as to why, say, Joe Rogan is an idiot.
You know what? I'm going to go ahead and revise that and not say that he's an idiot. I'm going to say that he's capitalizing on other people's ignorance. And so maybe fucking grifter would be a better
thank you.
A better characterization of him.
All right.
I think that he's clearly speaking to an audience that he has cultivated. And that audience doesn't like to be told what to do. They only like to take certain things, and that includes not vaccines, as well as they seem to have gravitated to this crew of people, sort of motley crew of failed scientists and so-called intellectual dark web people who have miracle cures for everything and want everything to be just very simple.
Yes.
I think that is sort of the thing that characterizes all these people. For all of his word salad, Jordan Peterson doesn't actually say anything other than vaccines bad. really, and maybe ivermectin good. And I think it's very tempting to look around at the past 2 years, which have been collectively traumatic for all of us, and to say, well, you know what? What if this wasn't a virus that we can't do anything about? What if this was about a bunch of people whose politics we don't like fucking up, and we can do something very simple to not only get rid of the pandemic, but to also give all these so-called experts the finger while we're at it.
Yeah.
And I think that's the crowd that Joe Rogan and Aaron Rodgers are really preaching to. And they're not really trying to win any hearts and minds. They're telling a captive audience what they want to hear.
So well said. The only thing I would add to that, and hopefully, maybe you can look into it a little bit more, is Joe Rogan forever has been selling supplements. And, the kinds of things that have no scientific basis behind them. They're not regulated often. And it's the kind of thing that makes your memory better, or makes your muscles stronger, or makes you more vibrant, or all these bullshit supplements. And so he kind of predisposed his audience to question scientific, medicine and treatments that are, quote, unnatural and support, quote, natural. I know you know all about that argument, but I'm just saying he's kind of predisposed his audience of MMA fighters, who love to work out, that if you drink this, you take that, your memory is going to be better. If you get an ice bath and then jump in, all that shit that he's done, he's always, predisposed. Okay, back to the lightning round, though, which is efficacy of masks. All masks are not equal, and all social situations are not equal. I prefer systemic reviews, studies of all the studies on things, but how are those conducted? Where were those conducted? What about kids versus, what about the efficacy of masks, would you want to say?
Yeah, so I think that this whole conversation, and this actually gets back to Joe Rogan, because he's had Vinay Prasad on his show before, Vinay is he's an oncologist at UCSF who just basically wants there to be a randomized, controlled, double-blind clinical trial for everything, including masks. And that's his number one argument for why masks don't work. There's never been an RCT. And that's just total bullshit. I mean, you don't need an RCT to say that if you jump off of a building, you're going to fall and potentially die, depending on how high that building is.
Although I do have a few people who I'd like to use in this test.
To enroll in such a trial, absolutely. But same here. Maybe starting with those people who want clinical trials for everything. But I asked, and early on, I wasn't convinced about the need for masks. And I studied rhinovirus for my PhD. It can be transmitted by fomites, by indirect contact, on surfaces and hands, much more so than SARS coronavirus 2. But because of the data, not randomized clinical trials, but randomized controlled trials, but just the emerging data about how masks work, I was persuaded very early on to change my tune. Will masks completely prevent you from getting COVID? No. But can masks reduce the likelihood of you getting COVID? Yes, especially depending on which type of mask you use. And I think this is one of the things that's very difficult to communicate, because really this is a simple concept. Some masks are better than others. A cloth mask, not great, not going to provide you with great protection if you're wearing it, but it certainly will reduce the amount of aerosol particles that you yourself are emitting into the environment. It can work for source control. We've actually known that for a long time in general. Surgical masks, same thing. They're a little better than cloth masks, not as good as an N95 or elastomeric respirator. The N95 elastomeric respirators, if they're properly fitted, can also provide significant protection for the person that's wearing them. And this isn't something you need a trial for. This is actually what the 95 in N95 means. It means it stops 95% of particles from coming into that mask. Again, if it's 95% of those particles, if it's properly fitted. So I don't think that this requires a trial. And anybody who's saying that, masks are terrible, they're causing all these problems for people, they're making people sick, people can't breathe with them on. I think masks are uncomfortable too. And I don't like wearing an N95 all day, which is actually why when I'm in containment, we wear PAPRs, because they're much more comfortable. Those are the
whole hood, the whole beekeeper.
powered air purifying respirator. Yeah, they have a motor and a HEPA filter in them so that air is filtered coming in and out. But, they work. We've known that N95s work for a long time. And I don't think we need to do controlled trials to confirm that they work. The thing is, a lot of people are sick of wearing masks. And I get that. Like I said, it's uncomfortable to wear a mask. I don't know. I'm not a pediatrician. I'm not a child development expert. Right. I don't know about what's going on in schools, but I do trust the American Academy of Pediatricians who say that masks are not harmful for kids either. So I just don't see the downside of wearing masks other than it's kind of uncomfortable and inconvenient. Yeah. But we're not going to be wearing them forever. And I really hate the way that this discussion has turned into either we never wear masks or we're going to be wearing masks for all of eternity. And if you don't wear a mask, you're going to go to jail and people are going to ostracize you and you're not going to be able to participate in society. Like neither of those things are true. And neither of those things make any sense.
Well, they do. They make a lot of sense.
They
make a lot of sense to get ratings and make money off ads and divide people and get votes. I mean, those to go to the North and South Pole and make everything a binary is what we're maybe conditioned to do. I think I'm just feeling uncomfortable that I'm telling you things you already know. But I think that's just from a media perspective. That is exactly what makes sense. But from a scientific perspective, of course, there's a tremendous amount of nuance and gray area. And that's why long form conversations, in my opinion, are the best way to learn stuff or reading.
I totally agree.
OK, final one, and I'll let you go. But I guess it's kind of the least sexy. Maybe I should have said Joe Rogan last. Testing. I know you have a lot of thoughts about tests. Again, all tests are not equal. The cost of tests, the distribution of tests, the funding, who wins, who loses, who's making money. But they're vitally important. It seems that they haven't been utilized nearly well enough by not only the federal government, but maybe even seemingly, local, state public health departments. They have been used well, it seems, by schools and organizations that have a lot of money for them. Maybe I'm onto something. What about where are we with the test's accuracy, distribution, application, and future necessity?
Well, so here's the thing about tests. Oh, boy. Yeah, you're right. This is the least sexy topic, but I think it is the one that people really need to know the most about.
Okay, so buckle in, strap in.
One of the things that has frustrated me the most is in the U.S. And in some parts of Canada, fortunately not Saskatchewan where I am, but is the lack of availability of rapid tests. Now, rapid tests are not a substitute for a PCR test. That's true. A PCR test is going to be more sensitive, but you can't run a PCR test at home, or at least most people can't. So the rapid tests, I think, are a good tool for when you can't get to a testing site. And it really is impractical to expect everybody to stop by Rite Aid a couple times a week to get swabbed for a PCR test. Not to mention, we don't have the capacity to actually process that many PCR tests. So having the rapid test, I mean, it's like taking a pregnancy test at home, honestly. If you're trying to get pregnant, or maybe you just don't want to get pregnant, it makes sense to take a pregnancy test. And those are readily available at any drugstore. If you want to not get COVID, you want to make sure that you're not going to expose the people that you care about to COVID, then it makes sense to take a rapid test, whether you're symptomatic or not. And this is something that also...
Or the people you don't care about, if you're one of those types.
Or the people you don't care about. Because you know what? This is the nature of infectious diseases.
Yeah.
The virus doesn't have a brain. The virus doesn't have thoughts or concerns or goals. The virus is programmed to do one thing, and that's make more viruses. And it can infect people you like. It can infect people you don't like.
I actually am only concerned about the vulnerable populations of people I personally know. Is that
right?
Is that a problem for society?
Yeah, I mean, see, the problem is that the people who say that, either they live radically different social lives than I do or than most other people do. Yeah. But unless all these people are living on one island where only people who you like are allowed, then those people are not safe. It doesn't matter whether you are taking a rapid test or your neighbor down the street is taking a rapid test. It doesn't matter whether you like them or don't. The point is that if somebody has COVID-19 and they're going out in public, then they're going to give that COVID-19 to somebody else. And then eventually, this is the nature of infectious diseases, it might get back to that person that you do actually give a fuck about. And that is why we should have testing right now. Now, do we need to be taking rapid tests every morning for the rest of our lives? Of course not. Once prevalence is down and there's not that much COVID going around, chances are you're not going to have COVID because viruses don't materialize out of thin air. A virus can't exist without a host, which is why, remember when I said earlier, there's some debate about whether viruses are even alive. This is why. Viruses can't reproduce without a host. They're obligate parasites. Technically, according to some definitions of life, you have to be able to independently reproduce. So viruses, by those definitions, are actually not even alive. A virus doesn't just come out of nowhere. Whether it comes from a bat, whether it comes from a raccoon dog in a market in China, whether it comes from your neighbor down the street or the person sitting next to you at church or the person across the restaurant from you, Sarah Palin.
Unbelievable.
You know, whoever it comes from, you're getting that virus from somewhere. So there's not a lot of virus around because everybody's gotten vaccinated and we all did our part to reduce prevalence overall. That's the amount of virus in the community. Then you don't need to take rapid tests all the time because there's not a lot of virus around. When we get to that point, we don't need to worry about masks as much. We don't need to worry about tests as much. But in order to get to that point, we got to do things that we're not doing now. Specifically, we need to get 90% of people vaccinated, 80 to 90% of eligible people. We need to wear masks until we get prevalence down. And then we can really start to, quote unquote, go back to normal or the new normal or whatever people are going to call it. I mean, things are not ever going to be the same. But no, we are not going to be living in COVID world where all we think about are COVID precautions, or else all we think about are rejecting COVID precautions. We will get to the point where COVID isn't first and foremost in everybody's mind. However, it's there.
Well, the only thing I'm going to be thinking about for the rest of today, at least, is raccoon dogs. Had no idea they were a thing. Looked them up after you mentioned it. And I'm pretty excited. I'm pretty excited to do my research on this.
I should have brought them up when we were talking about origins, because one thing that people, I think, don't know about origins is that SARS Classic in 2002, 2003 went back and forth between people and animals in the live markets in Guangdong province in China. Raccoon dogs and palm civets were two of the species that were most commonly infected. And a lot of people have said, well, why haven't we been able to find a raccoon, the smoking raccoon dog in China this time around? And it's because they culled all the raccoon dogs, they culled all the animals in the market, they've withheld the data, and they haven't allowed any sampling.
Oh, wow.
So we haven't been able to find the data because we haven't, or the index animal, because we haven't been able to look for it. And if they have looked for it in China, then nobody else has access to that data.
Dr. Angela Rasmussen, to be in your classroom was a real privilege for us, and I hope more people listen to this interview than anything else that I've done, because it's so important. You answered so many of my questions. I have so many more, and hope I get to talk to you again. But thank you for all the work that you've done, your entire career, and the way that you've been able to communicate it with me and so many others. You're doing excellent work, and we're so lucky to have you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me on, Pete. And I promise in the future, I'd love to come on with you, and I also promise to be better about emailing you back.
I dropped that ball. One
thing I need to work on, and I am in the process of hiring a team to help me out with some of this stuff, is actually just managing my correspondence, because I'm not very good at that.
Well, you should. I highly recommend my fake producer, Keith. He's a great kid. He's not a real person, but he's so easy to blame on when there is issues with correspondence. So that's one way to
I'll have to blame my fake assistant, Angie.
Angie has really dropped the ball.
Really dropped the ball. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Angie. It's great to talk to you.
My pleasure, Pete. Thanks so much for having me.
Me. She was going to say me. I'm sure of it. That's Dr. Angie Rasmussen, and somehow I pressed stop on the tape right before her last word. Wow, did I learn a lot from that conversation. She was so good. And then we talked for a long time after. about other things, politics, more science, and she said she really enjoyed the conversation, and I certainly did. So another great virologist that we get to talk to, who is an expert on infectious disease up there now in Saskatchewan. Very excited to have Dr. Angie Rasmussen on the show for the first time. Definitely go check her out on Twitter and let her know that you heard her on Stand Up so we can get her back, because she does have a massive following on Twitter at Angie_Rasmussen. Is it Musin or Musin? I keep saying it wrong. Anyway, Dr. Angela Rasmussen, Angie, let's just call her that. Great, great, great guest. I hope you learned as much as I did. Go check her out and say hi on Twitter. All right, well, that's it. That's all. I've just got the one guest today, but I certainly learned a lot from that conversation. I'm sure you did as well. So thank you very much for listening to it. Thank you for supporting the podcast with a subscription. If you haven't already, sign up now. Welcome to all new subscribers. It's so great to have you as part of our community. Hope to see you tonight at The Hangout, 8 p.m. East. If you're a subscriber, join us for a very special get-together each and every week right here. I don't know what here means. On Zoom. We'll meet you on Zoom. How about that? Tonight, 8 o'clock. You get the link in the email, and you can go to patreon.com/Pete Dominic to sign up right now, or standupwithpete.com. All right, John Carroll, take us away, my friend. I'll talk to you tonight, I hope.
Show your face of every color, yellow, black, red, and brown. She's the place where every lost child will finally be found. There's only one thing to do before we stand our ground, and that's stand up. Stand up. Well, the founding fathers saw a land for all. They had to stand up. They had to stand up. They had a keen imagination for a crystal ball, drawing all the plans of a stand up. But all they had to go on was the time they were in, with other causes for laws, and since they weren't even sin, they knew that change was gonna come before the change could begin. They had to stand up. All right, they had to stand up. We got to stand up. We got to look the devil square in the eye. We gotta let him know it's his time to go, and make it clear when all we hear is a lie. Why you lying awake wondering where the money all went? It'll be the cost of freedom that'll go unspent. You can see him flee the scene of that experiment if you stand up. All right, we got to speak up. We got to reach up and raise your voice in every way you know how. Don't be toes up. You got to show up. Ain't no better time to do it but now. No need to pledge allegiance to no wanton tribe. Rise up, show obedience to the voice inside, and listen well, and it'll tell you not to run and hide. It says stand up.